Good morning. Glad everybody came by to see us. We're talking about hey, the policy pulse. You know what's moving, what it means to your business. I've had the wonderful honor to work with these two very closely the last 24 months. I've been the GR chair here at ReMA, and if you don't know Kristen and Justin, I'm telling you, they are some of the best I've worked with on this. They are extremely focused on the issues, very issues generated, and that's extremely important. And during this current political environment, I think it feels different to most anybody in this room. No longer, no matter how long you've been on this earth, politics just aren't the same anymore. So I'd like to open it up with you two. And so what's so different now? What does that mean for us as recyclers? Either one of y'all can start, please.
You want to kick off?
Honestly, on the state level, the difference has been there's been a lot of increased interest in oversight, but also we are starting to see these issues, particularly, and we'll get into it later on the EPR, merge down across, the common line for the federal side is that, there's disagreements, there's fighting, you can't get things done. That has moved the pressure to the states to get things done. And there is movement across political lines, and there are also issues moving across political lines. So, go states.
To that go states point, the last time I did calculations, we had 48 laws passed in the previous Congress. That's in comparison to over 2,000 administrative actions. So that sort of tells you what Congress is doing right now. And that's not to say legislation isn't moving, but more we're prioritizing those larger packages, items that are more commonly agreed upon. We're in a environment where we have such incredibly narrow margins that these contentious issues that we're seeing aren't getting floor votes like they used to. If it is not typically, I say typically because this is not always the case, but if it is not typically a bipartisan piece that is commonly agreed upon, you're not going to see it move. But the administration has a little bit more leeway there. They have statutory obligated obligations that they need to fulfill, and they can move a little bit quicker than at least we are. I'd say at least in DC, a lot of the reframing that we've seen over the last really 2 years has been how can we elevate and grow United States manufacturing, domestic manufacturing. And that puts our industry in a really unique and I'd say a really exciting position right now, where we can talk about how we're supplying those U.S. manufacturers, how we are providing those strong, reliable supply chains, and our economic impact, not only from our jobs numbers, but for the tax bases that we're providing. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be in DC. That obviously there are caveats to that, but by and large, I think we're in an exciting space for the industry.
So we're going to go through some subjects, and we'll approach it from the federal and the state level. And I think the one that most recyclers, I know none of us knew about 10 years ago, but really kind of caught our ears, those of us who were coming to national meetings about 8 years ago when David Wagner approached us and talked about this thing called PFAS and the good old forever chemicals. So let's just start with the basics. We all know that PFAS is every place. It's in everything. But what does it mean in policy?
Wow. Okay, so let me start. How many folks in this room know that 4-letter acronym? Okay, most people, so I don't have to do a super deep dive, but for those that didn't raise their hands, so you're not sort of staring out into the abyss or into one of these lights, they were invented around the 1930s, mostly for the war and for military use. Manufacturing use increased around the 60s through the 70s and 80s. They are a class of chemicals. So when we talk about PFAS, we talk about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Depending on how you're defining PFAS, there's anywhere from 10 to 14,000 chemicals in the chemical class. They are typically heat, stain, water, grease, and corrosion resistant. So it makes them really valuable to the manufacturing sector, especially when they were first produced. Now, where do the issues with them come in? They are persistent, they are bioaccumulative, and they are ubiquitous in the environment. They do not break down. And there are several PFAS chemicals or several PFAS compounds, I'll say, that have been proven to be toxic, which is work that EPA is doing right now. We see states working to address those toxic PFAS, although sometimes we see policy sort of responding to the chemical class in bulk. Not always, though. But they're everywhere. And for recyclers, that means we're encountering them in automotives. We are encountering them in appliances. We have encountered them in food packaging, although we see a strong number of bans on intentionally added PFAS into those packaging means. We see it in carpeting. It's truly everywhere because it had such beneficial uses. Now, on the policy front, we say this came to ReMA's attention around the mid-2010s, and that's when government action really started increasing. But we saw it before then. We saw lawsuits in the 90s, primarily directed at PFAS manufacturers. Early 2000s, EPA, and I apologize, the Environmental Protection Agency began to research PFAS health impacts. Around 2006, we saw 8 PFAS manufacturers agree to phase out PFOA, and that is one of the more hazardous PFAS compounds. PFOA and PFOS is typically what we talk to. Around the mid-2010s, we saw large water systems being not required but suggested to test. Then we saw voluntary health guidelines come out. EPA was at work around that time period on a national drinking water standard. And then I think what we often pay attention to from the recycled materials industry perspective was the PFOA, PFOS, circle hazardous substance rulemaking. That's designating PFOA and PFOS. So 2 of the legacy PFAS compounds, the ones that were invented and used heavily between 30s, 60s, and onwards, as hazardous substances. PFOA was one of the ones that the manufacturers agreed to phase out. It's impacting the industry because that's where we're seeing not the most PFAS within operations, but we do tend to encounter those quite a bit. And we are not producing the chemicals. We are not utilizing the chemicals. We are not receiving any value from them being in the products, but we have to handle them at end of life. And through recycling processes, we're encountering them day to day. Whether it is in automobile shredder residue because they are in the carpeting, the upholstery, the fuel lining in the vehicles, whether we are seeing it in stormwater or groundwater if testing is required, and Justin's going to get to that when we talk through the state side, but it's an issue that we have to deal with. And so ReMA right now, we are challenging the PFOA, PFOS circular designation, not on the health impacts of that, but on the process that was undertaken by EPA in developing that, primarily on the cost analysis side. We felt that that did not accurately impact what impact this would have on the industry. We're also heavily engaged in Congress, trying to find some sort of passive receiver liability relief for you all as entities that didn't produce, manufacture, find any use for or of these PFAS chemicals, to make sure that you are not being held unfairly liable for contamination that you did not create. Now, that doesn't mean you won't have to abide by mitigation practices. You will, but making sure that you cannot be sued or held financially liable for this contamination that was not your responsibility. Now, if you have a deliberate release, that's something different. But the states are engaged far beyond that. And I know Justin has been working on a variety of things, either from bans to restrictions and more.
Yeah, I mean, before we go to the thing I want everybody to notice, she said PFOS and PFAS. Right, that's not just somebody's accent. That is 2 separate chemicals, right? And look, being from New Orleans with the funny accent, I always had to work that one out. So I just wanted to be sure.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As a New Yorker, we might need that.
Exactly. Right, Justin, tell us about the state side.
Yeah, so on the state side, we've really seen kind of 3 big buckets of legislation and regulatory movement. You've got the more recent movement towards liability. You've got the movement towards testing and mitigation, and then the movement towards restrictions. And restrictions has the broadest adoption at the state level. They really started out targeting the firefighting foam, targeting building off of the old heavy metals and packaging restrictions, and, looking to prevent that from being a source. But it is really morphed into broad scale bans, either targeting a large group of materials or just saying all consumer products, must not have PFAS by a set date. There are challenges that they've run into with those bans because as the departments of health or departments of environment have started looking into it, they've started to realize that there are applications, even consumer products, that there just is no current replacement for PFAS chemicals. They do their job too well. And that there's also some uses of it. I know it's come up in cookware and, internal components of electronics where, yes, PFAS is being used, but it's not in a way that is going to essentially be exposed until it gets to our members. So that becomes a problem on those restrictions. Our biggest concern on the product restriction side is honestly the difference between intentionally added language or the parts per million limits, or just the ones that say no PFAS. The intentionally added language tends to have language that it must perform a function or have, be intended to be in the final product. And that provides a certain amount of protection because honestly, any recycled material now is going to have trace amounts of PFAS likely on it simply because it's been out in the environment, and PFAS is in the rain. Therefore, it is on everything, and therefore it will be on anything that's made. PFAS is in the water. So a lot of the new products being made just have PFAS in them because water is a rather important part of any manufacturing process. But when they put in specific parts per million or parts per billion or even parts per trillion limits on how much PFAS can be in the final product, that essentially tells the manufacturers that they have to start testing their feedstock coming in to make sure that they're not going to wind up over that limit for even any of the components of the final product, which in turn means that the manufacturers are going to start looking to anybody supplying them products and say, hey, you've got to test what's coming into us because we can't take it if we can't be sure that we can provide, materials that are going to be below that limit. So that is the really big concern on the restriction side. On the, testing and mitigation side, I think most of the people in this room by now have probably heard about how Minnesota specifically targeted auto shredders as sources of PFAS contamination, even though the auto shredders were not the ones using PFAS in their operations. They were not the ones choosing to have PFAS. They essentially told them that since auto manufacturers, use PFAS as a fabric treatment, essentially throughout the interior of cars, that it was now the problem of the auto shredders to deal with that PFAS that was coming onto their facilities. And we had numerous conversations. I remember David Wagger asking the Minnesota regulators if they had tested the rainwater for, to establish a background amount of what is coming into, member yards to then know what is coming out of member yards. And no, they hadn't did that, and they weren't really certain how to do that. Well, have you tested the difference in, PFAS when you're this far from a, major water source versus farther? None of that. So the requirements are essentially coming down completely on recyclers. The other problem is the PFAS is very tricky to test for. This is not like some of the other chemicals where, it is easily located. It is a very complicated, I don't understand how it works, but I've been told that it is a very complicated test. And also, since essentially everything is contaminated by PFAS, if you are not very careful, it's very easy to contaminate the sample from your own stormwater simply by the clothing or gloves that you're wearing, because a lot of gloves also have PFAS on them. And the testing laboratories, if they aren't very careful, they can contaminate the samples that you sent in. So it just creates a rolling issue on just the testing alone. And then the mitigation, honestly, I know new technology being developed, but there just really isn't a good solution. They're looking towards the water, filtration systems, for the major public works sections. And that's where they're starting to look at the, liability issue, because those filtration systems for, public water sources are expensive. And so now the liability is coming up. They're also starting to realize that all of the biosolids that they sent off to the agricultural to spread on their fields, all of that was contaminated with PFAS. So strangely enough, they now want to give liability exemptions to all the biosolids that they told the farmers that they could spread on their fields. They want to give liability exemptions to the firefighters who were told that they had to use the PFAS containing firefighting foam. They're also looking at, what is deemed passive receivers of PFAS, the landfill operators, the solid waste, transfer stations, residential. And we very much believe that, since we do not use PFAS in our operations and we do not want PFAS in our facilities, that we should be included in that, passive receiver designation. Only difference is most of the passive receivers are, in some way public or public contracted businesses. We're private industry, but we serve an essential service. You need us to be around. Can't put us out of business, hopefully.
You talked a lot about the testing, and I know I'm going off script on you two a little bit, but I think this is a great point, because isn't the testing, a lot of those things are worked in after the legislation? It's in the rulemaking and that type of thing.
So,
Am I correct in saying that?
Minnesota wasn't legislation.
Was it? Just regulatory?
It was a public action plan.
Okay. So
that is one of the things there's been several looks at how to challenge, whether Minnesota has directly overstepped its authority. The issue being that if you are in a state where the court agrees with the authority that you may or may not have overstepped, then you will be fully seen as in your right to have done so. But in some of the other states that have been introducing testing requirements, that is also a concern where, like Virginia passed legislation that specifically said that it was going over, industrial users of PFAS. And we had our lobbyists clarify with Virginia legislature and the Virginia Department of Environment that, by the way, you're not going to turn this around to us, right? And it's like, no, we are definitely going after those who are actively using it in their manufacturing processes. But then as those regulations are developed and as the program goes through, if that drifts on to us, will that be respected?
So the point I was trying to make with that was that when we go back to our home states, is obviously we always watch the legislation, and we're working with our local lobbyists and people we can influence, legislators that we know personally. But once a law is passed, you got to stay engaged on the regulatory side and the rulemaking, because this is the details of the inaction or action can really put us in a box.
There was an UXO law in Texas a while back for unexploded ordinances, and then we got that regulation that just said, oh, well, if it comes on your yard, you're in violation of the yard law. And we kind of important that we got that taken care of.
So we'll keep with the alphabet soup stuff, and let's talk a little bit about EPR. We'll stay with you, Justin. Give us a little rundown on the EPR. For those of us who've been in recycling and especially involved in ReMA for a while, we always think about paper and packaging, but I've been hearing it a lot more in other groups. So talk to us about that. How's it creeping into other items, other recycled materials?
So just for everybody to know, EPR, extended producer responsibility, it is kind of part of a larger group that has kind of been referred to as product stewardship, or in some cases end of life management is now kind of becoming a term that's gaining its own traction. But you've got, this can kind of lump into the deposit systems, the bottle bills and such. You've got the take back programs, you have the fully funded EPR programs where the producers have to set up a program to actually collect from people. And there's been just You also have the advanced recovery fee, advanced recycling fee program that's a little bit more rare, but basically you're charged when you buy the product and you don't get that back at the end. That's supposed to go directly towards the actual recycling of the program or the product. So, kind of had its start in actually earliest programs were probably the rechargeable battery programs that actually did get passed in a lot of states in the 80s and 90s. And arguably, depending on how you want to look at it, the bottle bills, the lead acid battery laws, and, if anybody remembers the National Vehicle Mercury Switch Recovery Program. Steve, did I get that right? It's been so long since I had to use that acronym.
Just use it elves.
Yeah.
Elves.
But, essentially it's saying that producers have to take some responsibility in either the funding or the direct collection and management of products at the end of life. So it was always something that environmentalists, had appetite for. The first big kick was really from the electronics laws in the early 2000s, where you had all of a sudden CRT televisions and monitors were no longer a positive value product, and everybody had to figure out how to deal with those. Essentially found out that the manufacturers got too much control over those programs, and there were a lot of challenges for electronics recyclers operating underneath them. So now we've got this coming in for both packaging and batteries as the primary thrust of the 2020s. There's been a lot of improvements over past programs. Now you have more oversight by the state environmental bodies, which, trust me, can be a problem, but it's definitely better than giving full control to manufacturers. You have the development of advisory boards, which basically formalizes that all of the stakeholders, including recyclers, must be considered when developing the regulations, when administering the program, when determining where money will be spent. But you also have challenges that are coming out of these modern programs. Responsible end markets was not a phrase that anybody had on their lips before really Oregon introduced it to us. And now it is really bringing home to everybody that whether or not you are involved in the initial, distribution, collection, focus of these bills, if you are at all involved in handling those materials down the chain, from the intermediate processors to the shredders, to the, final, smelting yards, to even in some cases, they want to bring it down to the manufacturer of new products, that this is going to impact you. And the requirements of the environmental departments, again, that double-edged sword is going to impact what, is going on after you. For the packaging EPR, it's really a money thing. When China's markets really closed off in the late 2010s, the state, residential recycling programs were left trying to figure out, how do we pay for this collection? What do we do with the materials afterwards? How do we fund the upgrades that we've suddenly realized are, necessary to get materials to market in a way that's going to be accepted? And producer responsibility was the answer that, got settled on. We had Oregon, Maine, California, Colorado, Minnesota, Maryland, and Washington. Is that all 7? Did I remember that correctly? And then we, have several states that are going to be looking at it. New York, will they, won't they this year, but definitely Illinois, and honestly, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, Mid-America, arguably the Southeast.
And I think EPR is a bigger, it scares me personally because I know the states are going to be looking for funds. Yeah. When the feds start saying, I'm taking money away from the states for certain programs, the states don't want to stop doing what they're doing. So they're going to look for a way to fund it. And one of my concerns, and I know you guys are watching very closely, is that, well, what about from the national side? I mean, what are we seeing on the national landscape on EPR?
Well, the second you have a majority, and I don't mean 25 states, I mean when it becomes too onerous for manufacturers to operate under a patchwork of 7+ extended producer responsibility laws, once they're all in effect and operating, you're going to see them calling for a national EPR program. They operate businesses just like many of us in this room, myself not included. But that's a lot of regulations to comply with. And I think we can very easily see that above 10 next year. Really, I'd say once we hit 12, you tend to hit a turning point, or it's say a tipping point there. Conversations are already happening in Congress on extended producer responsibility. There is a draft bill right now that's being led by ranking member of the Energy and Commerce's Environment Subcommittee, Representative Paul Tonko of New York. I think they're on version 3 of that draft right now. It really began at the start of last January. We had a number of stakeholder conversations. The office is in a bit of a holding pattern right now because we are rapidly approaching midterms, and anything introduced or released before the end of this Congress just has absolutely not a shot in the stars. It's just going to circle the earth continually. But they are considering development of a national EPR program. Now, the last version of that bill I saw had needs assessments, which were great. We want to see states do those, but it wasn't a strict preemption, which I thought was interesting. So while you have your needs assessments, you're developing an EPR program, or the bill would have you develop your EPR program that works as your state needs it. So it's still leaving a bit of that patchwork in place for manufacturers. I don't know how much pushback that will get. My guess is a lot. But it's something we're watching and something we're monitoring. We actually met with the office 2 weeks ago, and we were told that they're welcome to continued conversations. I'll put out another draft. But I think once we see 10, 11, 12, it's going to become more a reality federally. And then batteries, of course, are entirely other issue.
Batteries is a big subject, right? Because we're hearing, I think EPR is like spreading by wildfire with the batteries, and that's why the battery working groups have worked on their guidance and everything else that they've done that. Yeah, wildfire is a bad term to use with batteries. The most metal recyclers, my apologies. So why is batteries moving this so much? Justin, on the state, and then when you finished up, Kristen, let us know what's going on with batteries at the national level.
So I think to a certain degree, you got that same aspect of, it is a safety issue. And as people are starting to realize, it's not just, it's definitely for our membership, for the, solid waste, membership, but also just for everyday people. Like you've had the horrible apartment fires where people just had no education on how dangerous these, lithium ion and other rechargeable batteries can be when they are improperly stored, improperly handled. I have a friend who is a very intelligent, professional in IT security, and he did not understand that the fact that his laptop had a visible swell in the middle of it meant that he really needed to get it out of his wooden house with his 2 small children, and this was not a good product to have anymore. And that's people just don't understand the warning signs to look at. And so you've been having all sorts of issues, both with transportation, with public safety, with the end-of-life management of materials. And there is that growing recognition that there needs to be both a pathway, because people don't understand which battery is dangerous, which battery is not. It was always the rule before, as an alkaline battery, just throw it in the trash, it'll be fine. But they don't understand that this one's a lithium ion battery, and you really, really shouldn't throw that one into the trash. So there needed to be essentially a collective program that didn't matter what the format, or rather didn't matter what the chemistry was, just covered everything underneath a certain size, gave consumers a pathway that they could responsibly put it into it, and it would be managed, to the end of life, and also give everybody else some place to deal with all these batteries that they did not want, to make sure that they did get to the stream, the battery recycling streams where they are desired materials, where this is part of their business model, to get this supply in and to recycle it, get these critical minerals back out in the stream. And that's why you've seen, unlike a lot of the other EPR, we had a bill passed in Nebraska this year, Oklahoma, and, Kentucky and New Hampshire are all, going to likely put forward legislation, or pass legislation rather. You've got bills in 20 states, red and blue. This is not a, partisan issue like typically EPR is seen?
Federal level. Well, what are we hearing on batteries?
So I think you've got, again, the conversation federally is being driven threefold. One, by policy requirements, two, by the critical mineral recovery, and three, by safety. And I might link critical mineral recovery and safety together, not prioritizing them. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act required that EPA develop battery collection best practices and battery labeling guidelines, in addition to developing a national EPR framework alongside the Department of Energy. I think they have until the end of September 2026, shake your head yes or no, to get that done. Yes, so that we've got until the end of September, so September 30th, it's the end of the fiscal year, to finalize that work. And they have been, I would argue, completing those statutory obligations better than I think I've seen anyone do just far, especially given that they've been charged with small, medium, embedded, large format batteries and battery energy storage systems to develop those labeling guidelines, EPR practices, collection. The work is ongoing. There's a lot of interested stakeholders in the space coming from the safety side of the house, especially from the material recovery industries, from municipals who don't know what to do with them. They're burning down their operations. It's a huge cost to state and local taxpayers, to recyclers and battery recyclers, electronics recyclers who want to be a vital part of that critical mineral ecosystem, making sure that we are putting those materials back out into the domestic sphere. Work is ongoing. When I met with the office I mentioned previously, I was also told that a national EPR program is next on their radar. So you may see draft legislation coming down the pipeline for that as well. Again, as more and more states pick this up, I think it is only a matter of time until we see a national effort.
Yeah, that drives me crazy.
But that's why it's so important that we're engaged at the state level so we can get this right. So when we start to see our members of Congress start to look at it, we have resources, we have tools, we have data to support what's needed in a good program.
We have to continue to keep the eye on preserving the markets that are established and not letting legislators think they have to create markets and that type of thing.
And I do think that there's some good movement on some of these work groups that are happening at the state level. Like you've got the states that are jumping into legislation, but I know Maryland, they've had a commission to advance lithium-ion battery safety that's actually ran for 2 years, looked at various aspects of it, and then decided that instead of introducing legislation this year, let's re-up the commission and look at this a little bit closer. And particularly, they want to look at the direct impact on transport issues that, the lithium-ion battery safety, is causing, the direct impact on insurance issues for, recyclers, for solid waste, and for anybody else who has a lot of batteries in their, facilities that, we all know that that's an issue. The state is starting to recognize that that's an issue. So there's honestly a hopefully more measured response on this than just, hey, there's an issue, let's pass it.
Okay, let's move on, huh? Good old metal theft. If you haven't had your head underneath the rock, copper, aluminum, cadmium, you name it, through the roof. When prices are up, lazy people decide to go steal stuff. And that causes problems for not only you and I as consumers, but obviously infrastructure, telecommunications, and then when you got some big players like AT&T and others who doesn't like their stuff constantly getting cut and stolen, and they're looking for someone to stick their hands around our neck. Unfortunately, they always come at us first. So what are you seeing on the state legislative side, most recently with metal theft in general?
So definitely, we've been seeing a little bit on movement on the catalytic converters. We've seen a little bit of movement on some other issues, but it's telecom. And the main problem that we have is that the telecom industry, we have done outreach to them, but they have more money than us. They have a lot of connections in states, from being essentially a utility. And they've been coming into the conversation, not looking at the laws that are on the books or not understanding the laws that are on the books and putting in their own principles. We have seen copper seller licensing requirements based on Minnesota, which they don't, then we talk to them and they realize, oh, maybe it's a bad thing to make mom and pop, get a license to sell the DIY plumbing that they did. With no understanding of the general terms for copper and brass. And so making essentially everything in the world critical infrastructure subject to these increased, restrictions, and making it impossible for an individual to actually sell critical infrastructure if you call all copper and all piping critical, and not understanding exactly what a holding period is and exactly what it would mean to require a business to hold all copper for 30 days. So the good thing is, in the states where we've been able to directly connect with those stakeholders, they've honestly been open to the conversations on it, because it really is, the problem is the copper wires. The problem is the fiber being cut incidentally. The problem is that while many states have critical infrastructure damage laws out there already that make, damage a felony, some states, the language is a little bit squishier, and some states just don't have that. And we've been shopping around. The the infrastructure wire work group put together a very good document that, we have available for anybody who is looking for it. We shared it out with our lobbyist network. It essentially identified the areas where we want to explore and the areas that we want to stay away from in infrastructure wire legislation. And what we've really found useful is bringing up the scrap theft alert, service, and suggesting that if there's a registration requirement, how about we start out with requiring that yards register with and use scrap theft alert, and that law enforcement use scrap theft alert, so that we know when there's been a theft in the area. Instead of these broad ranging definitions, let's focus it in on the wire that is being stolen, so that if that comes in, there's no ambiguity. That wire must be sold by a representative of a telecom or somebody who's authorized by a telecom. And the specific restrictions off of that definition then can go into, we can have a shorter practical holding period for that wire if it's required. We can have a conversation on cash restrictions and payment restrictions on that wire if it's required. But the big thing is to identify that and restrict that product, not a broadband.
Justin, you just led a working group on that. You just mentioned, and I sat in on a lot of those calls, and I thought the most fascinating part about it that I didn't think about was the penalties for infrastructure damage, right? And when you're trying to work with stakeholders with things like this, you always want to look for something to agree with. My good friend Chip Copeland, who always has fights very hard in the Southeast and many of those states, we want to find something that AT&T and other stakeholders, and we agree. We all agree we don't like thieves. I don't think anybody in our industry likes a thief. So how can we help you punish them more? So there's some terms you even talked about, domestic terrorism, right?
But the problem is, in some of the states, that is not the focus that they want to have. They do not, they actively have had that conversation in states where it's like, well, we can't make it a felony to disrupt, service to thousands of homeowners, because what about the criminal? And unfortunately, that is the conversation in many of those states. And that's when we do have to start looking at, all right, what is the level of disruption? What is the level of damage inflicted by this interruption that will make you accept that this is a felony, that this was an intentional act that endangered thousands of people's lives, that cut off the ability to work, the ability to take care of your family? Give us what we need for, to make this an actual felony, to put the, thieves in prison for a long enough time that they don't just come out and do it again. Because we've seen that on catalytic converters. We are seeing it currently on telecom. There are people who make this their profession, and they will not stop unless they're put away.
So we talked about telecommunication cable. We talked a little bit about catalytic converters. Those are things that affect the public and get legislators moving quickly to try to figure out some kind of Band-Aid. And most of the time it's horrible legislation. But with metal theft, our industry even got touched, right? And with the rising cost of copper, loads of copper driving across the United States upwards of over $200,000. So cargo theft has become a big issue. Kristen, what are we hearing on those fronts up at the federal level?
Cargo theft is a huge issue. And so I want to quickly tell a story because I had a conversation with some of our members just before our fly-in in February. We were speaking in January, and we're seeing some instances where people are losing 20, upwards of 40% of their annual revenue to these organized crime networks. That impacts your ability to supply our manufacturers. It's a huge safety risk for you and your operations. It potentially means that you have to reduce the number of employees that you have if you're losing that revenue, and you can't invest. And it's a huge issue, not just for us. Cargo theft on a whole has risen for 2025. It was around 18% compared to 2024. And you might go, and that's kind of a small number. It's just 18%. The total value of materials stolen increased by 60%. Our thieves are switching, and I think the numbers will change for 2026, but in 2025, we saw groceries and food as the number one most stolen commodity. Metals are rapidly reaching that. And I think by the data, we will be surpassing, if not equaling that come 2026. So I don't love to see that. Nobody likes to see that. You'll get a full data outbreak if you come. I wrote this down so I don't forget it. There's a session tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. on freight and cargo theft. We're going to have CargoNet come and speak, run through existing data on thefts, and then what you can do in your operations to mitigate that. But outside of that front, because I can't give you that mitigation techniques. I'm a policy wonk. I sit in DC. I couldn't tell you how operationally that's done. But outside of what you can do operationally on the policy side of the House, we are hearing calls from Congress to pass the Combating Organized Retail Crime Act. And you might go, retail crime, I deal with scrap metal. Don't tell anyone I said the S word. I deal with recycled materials. That doesn't impact me. And last Congress, it didn't. But through very coordinated advocacy efforts, through 80 plus associations and other stakeholders who are experiencing cargo theft, we were able to get cargo theft included in that bill. And that is a huge victory. It provides law enforcement with the enforcement tools needed. Oftentimes these crimes occur across state lines and across international borders. So they have found themselves with their hands tied behind their backs. It creates a national coordination system. I think of scrap theft alert or cargo theft, but at a large scale, right? For our law enforcement entities to identify these crime networks, where they're headed and where their next move is going to be. And because they are becoming increasingly sophisticated, it will also create a new program within HSI to devote additional funding and resources so that the feds can step in and stop this. It's got broad support. It passed through committee unanimously. And the last time we met with the Speaker's office, there was some hesitation about bringing this to the floor because it moved through on voice vote. As most pieces of legislation are moving these days. The only problem is when you move something on voice vote, you don't know where opposition may fall. But what we're hearing is that it's likely to move on suspension in the coming weeks. And so it'll move through with limited debate. This will be a huge victory, not only for our industry, but for several others. We are working through finding some appropriations in the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development package as well to push more on the mitigation side of the house. So, right, it's great to be able to find the thieves and find a lost load once it's been stolen. But how do we stop that in the first place? So cargo theft is impacting everyone. If you have a story to tell, I implore you to share it with your members of Congress. The more vocal we can be on how this is impacting you, how it's impacting supply chain security, how it's weakening U.S. economic competitiveness, we need to be up there.
Before we get off of theft, I need to go back a few years. I remember coming to these meetings and we heard one thing, catalytic converter, right? Valuations coming back up, getting cut off again, issues. So what are we seeing on the state side as far as catalytic converter activity? And then I'd love to hear on the federal side also.
So there have been a little bit of movement on the catalytic converters, but honestly, it's been the states that have been continually debating. Missouri has now for 6 years, I think, been debating the same set of laws. Ohio has been, similar situation, I think, for 4 years, trying to work out its issues with, updating its catalytic converter requirements. My big concern again is that since it's in the news cycle, we're going to see that flowing back in again, because at this point, every state but Wyoming has specific requirements for the purchase of a catalytic converter on the books. This is not a situation where there is not established law. Every state's got it, except for Wyoming, which apparently is where you want to move if you don't want to have your catalytic converter stolen. But, it is. The problem at this point is, what more do we do once we've already restricted the seller, restricted possession, restricted, the payment, restricted how long you can have to keep the material? We've put in the restrictions that we have, can. There's not a lot more to restrict in a lot of states.
But Kristen, I've been on a few calls with you lately, and it is finally up at the federal level. What's going on with that?
I was hoping we'd be able to solve this at the state level, Justin.
We did, I thought. 49 state laws specifically addressing.
So do we all. So similar to the cargo theft issue where law enforcement is saying they need more coordination, they're saying the same for catalytic converters. We've seen a bill over the last four Congresses in different iterations move through called the Preventing Auto Recycling Thefts Act. It is a national bill to regulate and hopefully stem catalytic converter theft with a couple different provisions to it. One would require OEMs mark all of their catalytic converters on the line. It creates a grant program for catalytic converters that may currently be in use, so couldn't be marked on the line because someone is actively driving that vehicle right now. And then also places restrictions on the recycled materials industry. It creates new record-keeping requirements for anyone who would purchase a catalytic converter. So in addition to your state requirements, because there's no strict preemption in this bill, which is why it's going to get a little wonky, you'd have to record the VIN or unique identifier number if it's on the catalytic converter. Many will not have them. Not many OEMs are currently marking the seller's info, the make, model of the vehicle, and then there's one other component to it. We are working at length with congressional staff and other stakeholders right now to get that amended to make it less onerous for you all. Is it still a duplicative requirement to what you're doing at the state level? Yes. In some cases, it's even more onerous to what you're doing at the state level. The previous version that we saw in the last Congress prohibited the sale of any detached or decanned catalytic converters, which would have shut down the processing, smelting, refining industry almost entirely. So poorly crafted from the perspective of the industry that's actually doing this work. We rely, I think it's around 20% of the critical minerals that are in catalytic converters come from the recycling supply chain. And so without that supply chain, our manufacturers will also suffer, and we will have to look to foreign actors to get those materials. And they're not in foreign actors that we have great relationships with. So we'd love to keep preserving that for you all. We're working with staff right now to craft a couple of amendments. I think we are moving in a positive direction. This is not perfect by any means, but this is an example of what we're seeing bubble up to feds when they don't feel, and stakeholders don't feel like a state solution has solved the problem. We then see it. And when you try to place a one-size-fits-all solution across the country, you'll see difficulties.
Yeah. We have two mics in case anybody wants to ask a question. More than welcome to step up. We'll start to wrap this thing up a little bit here, but I guess, considering everybody in the room and what we haven't talked about yet that you guys are working on at the federal first and then the state level that may affect that we haven't spoke about yet. I'll be with you 1 second. Go ahead, please.
I want to talk about tax policy. Not because it's fun. I also have not yet filed my taxes, so I have to do that this evening.
Ooh.
Ooh, indeed. But we saw one big beautiful bill, the Working Families Tax Cut Act, passed That was an incredible achievement for the industry. The largest tax package we saw since the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, right? So it's creating a more stable, more pro-investment framework for your operations. And we secured a couple of really strong victories in here that I love to highlight, and we'll be sharing in a press release later this week. But the full immediate expensing of R&D costs for you all. I know many of you are either partnering with others or completing your own research and development to see what new technologies are scalable within your operations. We increased asset expensing from a $1 million cap to a $2.5 million cap. There is now 100% bonus depreciation for qualified property, so you no longer have to separate that out. And then you have full expensing on qualified production property. That was a huge achievement. We were very thankful to support it. From those tax provisions. Again, we'll be doing a press release later today. If you are interested in the full slate of what it has to you, ReMA does have on our tax policy page an overview of OB3 and what recyclers qualify for within it. Second is forthcoming, and it's not something I think we're going to see this Congress, and that's not because I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic with our friends on the Hill, but just the realities that we're operating within. There's a cultivating investment in Circle Act, is Cultivating Investment in Local Circular Economies Act, which is a 30% recycling infrastructure investment tax credit with a 30% phase down over 10 years. That is incredibly exciting because it will allow you all, as you invest in new equipment, whether it's new balers or new safety equipment, so fire suppression technologies or new software to help you manage materials, could potentially be eligible for that tax credit. It has been introduced. We are steadily garnering co-sponsors right now. It is awaiting introduction in the Senate. We are still searching for a Democratic co-sponsor, but it has been included in the House Democrats' Affordability Act package. Again, it does not have a chance in this Congress, but could it become a reality in the next? Yes, especially as we position the industry as a vital source for those critical materials. This will help you all process more, deliver more to the manufacturing supply chain, increase your workforce. We're super excited about it. If you want to learn more, if you want to figure out how to be engaged with ReMA or other stakeholders who are advocating for it, please let me know. But we're here to talk through next steps there.
Justin, I'm going to hold you off 1 second. Yep. Please give us your question, sir.
So in a case where it's been intentionally tampered with, Justin, I think you've seen some of that at the state level.
There are several state laws that specifically deal with intentionally defaced or, VINs or other markings removed from either any kind of metal or specifically for catalytic converters, generally requiring that, those will fall under a hold or reporting requirement, or they'll fall under essentially a restricted seller of, you have to now prove why and how you own this, product. Also falls under the, possession restrictions that we've seen, put into place, where if any law enforcement, pulls over and there's a detached catalytic converter, particularly if it's been defaced and the person doesn't have proof of ownership, then that becomes an immediate problem for that person because they've now broken the law on possession of a detached catalytic converter. But also on the point on, inspection of records, we do not provide legal advice to our members. But we do provide summaries of all 50 state laws, and being the one who writes the summaries of all 50 state laws, I can say that all 50 states do require you to allow inspection of records by law enforcement. So it might be worth it to comply with those requirements and not have them have to, run around with those inspection requirements. It's not a good look.
Yeah. The question I was going to ask, I reside in the state of Texas and familiar with some other states. In Colorado, do you have an advisory, stakeholder advisory group?
They did.
They did?
Got repealed last year.
Oh, that's a shame. Because okay, because I know I know in the state of Texas, that's been extremely effective for the recycling coalition to work along with other stakeholders and law enforcement, DPS, in the state of Texas to really work on educating the recyclers and also the troopers in their inspection process. And it sounds like that's been a really great solution, a partnership.
Yeah, but
Well, we appreciate your engagement.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
interaction and training with your law enforcement, Todd Foreman, he's on our staff, he can help set up a training, session with your law enforcement to inform them of what you all do in your yards and how that works, and how they can enforce.
One more question. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, can we?
The mic doesn't appear to be working, guys.
Intention for those programs to extend outside of the U.S. So when the manufacturers export, will there be like a requirement on them to make sure that wherever they export the end product, that country or that jurisdiction should also be enforcing the EPR?
That directly gets into the responsible end market discussion, and it's not so much the enforcing the EPR, but basically Oregon is currently, back and forth on finalizing, but there are requirements in Oregon that essentially say that any end market that the materials are sold through and processed through must abide by certain standards that the Oregon DEQ is saying, are required for materials collected through the program. And essentially the requirement is not exactly on the end market itself, but essentially unless those processors all the way to the end market are verified by the system and that chain of custody is essentially established on this is going to be where it's sold and processed and, finally consumed by, the MRF and other, recyclers receiving funding through the program cannot sell their materials. So it essentially leaves potentially the materials collected through the program without a market if the requirements are too onerous and confusing for the end markets, because we understand the desire for, ensuring that materials are recycled, and not just collected and tossed out the side. But once, honestly, our argument has been, both once materials are shredded and, commingled, you can no longer track them as coming from a certain source. And I know commingling means a different thing on the, actual residential collection side, but also if the threat or if the concern of potentially failing to be authorized as a responsible end market is too great, processors and end markets are simply opting out of, even taking that step in the first place because they don't want to have it on the record of, I failed to be considered a responsible end market by the state of Oregon. So better than that, let's just cut that out of our stream. And then you're left with a producer responsibility program that has successfully enhanced collection and processing and has no market to sell to.
Okay. I thought, but initially you mentioned funding, and who would be funding the program? The manufacturer or the?
In the case of the packaging programs, it is, fairly clear cut, and there's actually a flow chart essentially of who gets stuck with the bill. But ultimately it is the producer or those who bring the product into the country or the point of sale that are charged. And the big thing that has come out of the packaging discussions is the eco-modulated fee, which basically says that if your product is easy to recycle and if you've used recycled materials in it and if you've, promoted education properly, then your fee is this much. And if your product is hard to recycle, if it's a negative value, if it's, just difficult at all in the system, if you have refused to, consider any of the other points in this, then your fee is this much. So it really is honestly, we see the eco-modulation as one of the more positive sides because it directly encourages design for recycling in a way that matters to the producers, which is their pocketbook.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I think we got about 10 minutes. So I really want to kind of now talk about action and how do we want to engage? So what's the most effective way for us in this room to engage and what does that look like today?
I want to see y'all meeting with your members of Congress on the state side, your legislators, your city council people on a regular basis and not just when you need them. I feel like I often get a lot of calls from our membership going, hey, I've realized there's this bill that we don't love moving through Congress right now. How do I get into that office? How do I push an amendment? And I think we hear it the same on the state and local side going, hey, I just found out about this. What can I do in the next 24 hours that I have? If you don't have any relationship with that office in advance, there's not much that's going to happen. You cannot only come to your elected officials or your regulatory agencies when there is a problem. You have to start building that relationship years and months in advance, educating them on who you are, what you do, the issues that matter most to you. And then they can help you when you need it. But coming to them with an urgent issue often is going to lead to everyone being disappointed.
And building on that point, we can help you. It is easier than you're worried about, to engage with your policymaker. On the state level and on the local level, these are literally people who might be working next door to you and you just did not realize that is also your state legislator. On the federal level, you'd probably know if they were working next door to you, but they are very eager to talk to you as business owners and operators in their, constituency. And we have, guidelines, but also you could just call us up the week before this convention. New member in Idaho, interested in looking at how to encourage electronics recycling in Idaho, which apparently does not have a very strong electronics recycling, market or culture. And we talked through it with him. We looked at, there's a bill in Utah that, or law in Utah that would actually be a fairly good match as far as low level of requirements, neighboring Republican state. And it just turns out that his representatives are the chair, I think, of the House Environment Committee, his senator is in the, Senate Environment Committee and is the chair of another committee. So he has two very powerful legislators directly representing him who presumably are going to have interest in this issue. It's honestly, it kind of felt like a golden win as we gave it to him. And it's just like, here's what you need if you need any more help reaching out. But literally their home phone numbers were posted on their pages because it's Idaho. So it's just like during, reasonable hours, give them a call, explain who you are, and ask to meet. And they're probably going to be extremely interested. And if they're not, then come back to me and then we can, see how we need to frame it. But
Do fly-ins really work? I mean, we do them in DC, and then I know we do a lot of state. I know we do state stuff also, right? But tell us about the impact of a fly-in on the federal level, and then also at the state level.
Well, I love the DC fly-in. I got my start in the policy world doing fly-ins. So whenever I have an opportunity, I'm your staff at the trade association, right? I'm not on the ground. I'm not working your operations. I don't know what's impacting you on the day to day. I don't know what your workforce needs. I don't know where you're looking at innovating. And I don't have that direct relationship with that office. I can't say, yeah, I employ 500 people right in the district, but you all can. And you can come into that office and you can tell that story. You can build that close relationship. We can bring them out to visit you. And they're able to put a face to the industry that's not just mine, as nice as it is some days. Fly-ins are incredible to showing how strong we are, especially how strong we are when we work together. I would encourage all of you, if you are a ReMA member, if you are interested in joining us at our congressional fly-in, to do so. We're shifting the dates around a little bit for next year because it's right after midterms. So a lot of offices are just getting settled. Some will still be in a basement. So we don't like to harass them at the start of February. But please come on out. Join your other industry members, join your colleagues, tell the story of the work that you're doing in those districts, in those states, the employment you're providing, the economic impact you provide, how you're innovating, how you're contributing to the economy. They want to hear from you. We're nice when there's an issue, but they need to build that relationship with all of you in the room.
And it's also something you can do at the chapter and state level, organizing that way, making certain that you come in, you can target in on the legislators that, you have facilities in, but also the leadership. And it really is, again, these are people who are in your community. Was over with the West Coast chapter recently. They invited me to their fly-in, and in a meeting with one of their, legislators, they mentioned that, one of the businesses operated a business that allows you to go onto their yard and, pull out materials from vehicles. And the guy goes, "Is it over here? I go there all the time. That's part of your membership." And all of a sudden we had that direct connection because it turns out they were a backyard mechanic and they go to, the pull apart and pick up pull style. And that's what the connection was. And all of a sudden, very, very direct connection, very interested in our issues, 100% on our side. So it's the finding out those personal connections on how that's going to come home to the legislator on their day to day. And that might, for those of you who aren't in the residential field, always remember ReMA includes residential recyclers. ReMA includes paper and plastic. Use that in your connections, don't just focus in on the material that you personally provide, services for. ReMA as a whole, recycling as a whole, use whichever material brings that home to the legislator.
A lot of the issues we talked about today affect other businesses, other industries. In fact, our sheer existence as recycled materials producers affect people who receive our material, right? So if we're not able to operate well, it's going to have they're going to have issues. Talk about some of the coalitions that you guys are working on where we can work with other industries, other associations to get our voice a little louder in those state halls or the federal areas. If you want to start with you, Justin, then we can move to that.
So, we've got the obvious ones. You've got the National Waste and Recycling Association, where it's important that we coordinate with them because they're representing the MRFs and the landfills. A lot of our issues, cross over. And also we want to make sure that it is clear that, they are representing the MRFs and the landfills, and we are representing all of the other recyclers as well as the MRFs. So in some situations where, and not to put it down, but in some situations, it's very important to be involved with these other organizations because otherwise they're going to be potentially the ones saying that they represent the recycling industry, and maybe they don't as much. But on that case, the recycling partnership, which is actually, despite its name, made up of producers who are involved in packaging recycling, but very good, partners in addressing some of these issues. Actually, funnily enough, it was from a call with the recycling partnership on packaging producer responsibility that I found out why I keep on seeing these really weird bills on automotive fluid EPR cropping up. And it's because the automotive fluid packaging people didn't like California's law. So they thought that creating an entire EPR program for their entire chain of custody would be the way to get around it. And when it came up to our California members, they actually kind of scratched their head and it's like, well, maybe not, but we don't want the oil either. So sure, take it. It might be good for us. But, all those different, the producers, the, retailers, on the tire side, we've got the USTMA, the tire manufacturers, the Tire Industry Association, essentially tire retailers. And you've got us representing the tire recyclers. It is important that that full product line, from, soup to nuts is covered.
Federal side, Kristen.
I would say a lot of the same associations that Justin just mentioned on the commodity side are so incredibly important to interacting with. We have a great relationship with the Steel Manufacturers Association because over 70% of steel made in the United States is made with recycled steel. That number is going to continue to grow to 80, 90, I think, by 2040. With that relationship is incredibly vital. They have a good voice with the administration. They have a good voice in Congress. When you look at America, you think of steel manufacturing. Having that tie-in with recyclers is important. Same with the Association of Plastics Recyclers, Capital Plastics. But we also have some uncommon groups that we work with. So the Auto Alliance, for example, or auto manufacturers, right? All our commodities fall within an automobile. So why wouldn't we engage with them to a degree? We're heavily linked in with National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber, individual brands and producers. So you really have to keep a wide scope when you're looking at coalition building, when you're working at cross-industry, cross-association, cross-policy engagement. You don't want to leave anyone out of the table unless they really don't belong there, because a lot of times our issues will cross-cut or will impact them in some way.
But I'd also encourage all of you, we have these state level ReMA associated, state associations, but also almost every state has a association that is more focused on state and local regulators and also environmental groups. Get involved with those groups. They can be an extremely good ally, or they can be kind of our worst nightmare if they are dominated by those who are environmental advocates but do not understand the actual process that goes into making sustainable environmental solutions. Because we have had really good bills come out of some of those groups, and we've had really bad bills coming out of some of those groups. I know I've been a part of the Northeast Recycling Council, which is kind of an aggregate of many of those state groups, for just a long number of years. It is a great opportunity to talk to your regulators. Again, regular people that you can have those conversations with, get on a first name basis with, and then when something comes up in your state, they call you and they want to know your opinion on it. And if your opinion is that it's got some real problems, then they want to work with you to fix it, versus talking to the local environmental association and asking them their thoughts. And they said, that's great. It sounds like it's going to make it extremely better to recycle. And they don't understand that they've actually just shut down the entire market.
And I think it's important, Justin just flagged, working with entities that you wouldn't normally think of. We see a lot on the environmental side of the house, especially in the more environmental at all costs, environmental sustainability at all costs, associations or just groups broadly. Every conversation with them, though, is a conversation to highlight how you all are doing work that impacts their very priorities. You're decreasing GHG emissions, you're reducing energy use, you're putting materials back into the environment, and you play a role in that same circle that they're advocating for. And you might come to the table at first, and you might get turned away, but don't stop coming to that table. Continue to be a part of conversations.
It's all about showing our value. So speaking of that, I hope everyone enjoyed this session. I hope it was informative. But if nothing else, I hope you realize that ReMA has two of the brightest people in working on this every day for you, and utilize them.
Kristen Hildreth and David Weiger.
Oh, I'm serious.
As Justin Short's name was left off, our AVP of state.
Justin and Kristen are some of the best in the industry. They truly understand the issues. If you have any questions, feel comfortable to going back to them and asking some other questions. And thank you guys for being engaged today. We appreciate it.